In part 1 of the Midroom series, I demolished 2 of the 3 cupboards that constituted the midroom, and was shocked at how effectively it changed the space from a dark hallway into a new room. In part 2 I tried the same trick with the 3rd cupboard. Removing cupboard 3 didn't have the same magical effect that the first 2 had, but it was worth doing anyway. As I observed in part 2, when I was patching in all the former pipework holes in the floorboards, the cupboard's unconventional depth was probably to hold some long ago removed water heating system in front of the central masonry house holding up column. This meant that the cupboard was unusually deep, and it was hard to reach anything in the back of the closet unless you were Victor Wembanyama. Lily and I discussed what we would want the unit to do for us if we were to put a new closet there. Lily's biggest priority was to have a place to hang our coats, as we had been keeping them in our bedroom wardrobes until now. I measured the rails in the wardrobes and our biggest coats that were hanging on them, which helped define a couple of the dimensions. Then I added a cupboard above it to fit some linens and earmarked the bottom for some drawers. With the cupboard defined, my plan was to work around the brick column by making the storage accessible from the other side. So that meant, a bit like my office shelves, putting a shelving unit on the other exposed face of the cabinet, where the storage space would be much more useful. We discussed finishes for the closet, and Lily liked the edges of the birch ply that I made the office shelves from, but we didn't really want the face of the cupboard to be so woody. And it felt kind of mad to buy birch ply at today's prices only to paint it. I ended up deciding melamine coated birch ply would tick a lot of boxes. It would look modern, it would be a lot brighter, and it would be easy to keep clean. I found a local supplier for my sheet materials, and they offered a good price on CNC cutting the melamine ply as well, which saved me the difficult job of cutting the mela-mean surface without causing any damage to it. I also threw caution to the wind and bought some brand name MDF, in this case Medite, which they were able to supply in unusual 5-foot wide sheets as well. That meant that I could only buy 2 of them for my cutting list, rather than 4 4-foot sheets. 4. And I also opted for some cheaper than birch poplar ply for my drawer boxes too, as a final materials indulgence. I undertook this project with no illusions about how wonky all the surfaces in the house were. So I started by taking a leaf out of Peter Millard of 10-Minute Workshop's books, and I built a plinth for the cabinet to sit on, which I then faired and levelled so I could build the cabinetry on top with confidence. The 5-foot MDF sheets were surprisingly heavy and difficult to move, so I did my first cut out in my front yard rather than carrying them down to the workshop. After my first cut on the uneven surface, I didn't have much faith in my guide rail, so I ended up doing the rest of the cuts by trusting the sheet's original edge as being straighter than my rail. And it could also flex in the same direction as the sheet I was trying to cut, which made it work alright. Getting these initial cuts done made the sheets much more manageable and movable. Once I had them in these long sheets of the right width, I then got my final height measurement by cutting it a little bit too big, then bringing it indoors and checking how much clearance I had, before cutting it down to the right height. I then cut the other pieces once I had this reference sheet. At this point I discovered the walls were even more wonky than I expected, and the brick column I was trying to hide with this cabinet was flexing out at the top by about 30mm compared to the floor. I really should have checked this with the laser level much earlier in the process, so I had to sit for a bit to consider the repercussions. I eventually decided there wasn't much to do but to just get on with it. I'd been thinking about how to assemble the main carcass for a while, and after looking up the price of a Festool domino, I decided I was overthinking it and dowel pegs would be just fine for my starving artiste's budget. So I completely forgot the right way of using my doweling jig, instead marking everything up as accurately as I could manage, then drilling it all not quite accurately enough. Doing this in winter meant the daylight out the front of the garage didn't last very long, so I brought it inside to keep drilling all these questionable dowel holes. At least coming inside meant I could change into my slippers. cut a jig, a story stick of sorts, out of one of the scraps so I could make sure I got the shelves at a consistent height across the cabinet. I did a test fit in situ, and it looked like it was going to go together. So I decided to take heed of a previous lesson and paint all the materials before assembly. This room was becoming decidedly green, so I abandoned my previous yellow ambitions and decided to embrace the green. I figured that the dark green on the wall was analogous to the dark green in the rug, so I wanted to paint the inside of the cabinet a colour that was equivalent to the light green in it. After looking at every colour book possible, we ended up choosing another expensive paint colour. But this time I took it to the actual paint shop to get a trade colour match.
That looks quite good.
And I got a much better result.
Good colour.
I gave it all a priming, followed by a couple of coats of satin wood, which should be a nice durable finish for inside the cabinet. When all the paint was dry, I brought it back into the midroom to try and assemble it. Which went okay until it very much didn't. It would have been so much easier to assemble this laying down and then tip it up. But I was convinced that even with the plinth separate, I wasn't going to have the clearance with my low ceilings to build the cabinet laying down and then be able to tip it up. And I felt like it shouldn't have been as difficult as it was to assemble it upright in situ. As much as I was misusing the doweling jig, I realised pretty quickly that the jig itself was really trying to encourage me to use 8mm dowels in this 18mm timber, rather than the 6mm dowels I'd instinctively reached for. So I did switch to 8mm dowels after my first few holes, but all these mishaps while trying to assemble it taught me why. The 6mm dowels totally weren't strong enough for the job, and they kept snapping under the stress of this 18mm MDF. Everything was still looking nice and plumb at least, which was one saving grace amongst the litany of errors. The next error I discovered was that I got one of my dimensions wrong, and I was making 80% of the cupboard about 20mm too wide for my plans. The cupboard was supposed to be as wide as the hallway that led into the room. At least it was too wide and not too small, and that meant I could just trim everything down. While I pondered how on earth I was going to get this assembled, I secured the plinth down in its final position. I finally conceded to trying to assemble the cabinet laying down to prove it wasn't going to stand up like I thought.
I'm pretty sure it's not going to work.
And I took advantage of the fact that Lily's brother was visiting to help me try and lift it up, even though I was so convinced it wasn't going to work. To my absolute shock, it tipped up just fine, but I think we only got away with it because it didn't have the third side on it. Then sliding it into the plinth was a lot like the experience of installing the shelves into the office. It felt like it was never going to go in, until it just slid into place perfectly. Now the rest of the cabinet was in situ, I could start sneaking up on the fit of the outermost piece, like I did with the inside panel. I ended up effectively having to scribe the panel to the wobbly ceiling, which I then trimmed down a little bit with the electric planer. I really wanted to avoid putting screws in the outside face of this cabinet, so I tried to put a few pocket holes around the corner. But because of my dodgy dowel holes, I ended up giving in and putting some screws through the side anyway. It finally got this main carcass assembled properly though. So one of the reasons I had avoided doing this project sooner in the midroom is because I had this plug socket on the wall right by where this closet was going. Because I was planning on putting drawers in the bottom section, I was worried that I was going to recreate my favourite drawer in my kitchen. So it took me a while to figure out how I was going to avoid that. I ended up finding a really low profile socket that didn't really offend me in its looks. So I swapped the old one out, and the fitting of the new socket went better than I expected, even if I had to put a bit of filler in and touch in the paint afterwards. With this main carcass assembled, I angled the cabinet to the wall and the ceiling. I'd been feeling like I was doing a really bad job of this project, with all of my terrible mistakes I'd made so far. But I managed to turn that feeling around when I put a shim in to fill the gap against the wall. It made me feel so much better about the project as it tidied the job up so well. Which was silly considering that this shim was going to be pretty much invisible when the project was finished anyway. Next I went to fit the two doors for the cabinet. The top door was a slightly new experience for me as I got a lift mechanism to hold the door up when it's opened. But that ended up being really easy to fit and it worked really well. Much more annoyingly though, I didn't avoid the job of cutting all the melamine ply after all. As due to my earlier miscalculation, I had to trim 20mm off of it all as well. The smaller fronts weren't so bad as I could trim them all down with a stop block on the cross-cutting sled. A very shallow cut through the mela-mean on each side got a nice clean edge, before cutting through the entire thickness of the board. But it meant that each cut was 3 passes on the saw, and it was unnecessary work. With the doors all trimmed though, I made a bit of a meal of boring the holes into the door for the hinges. But they were forgiving enough to work anyway. With the doors on, the cupboard was actually starting to look pretty good. As the sheets were thinner, I brought my poplar ply straight down to the workshop to start making the drawer boxes. At this point, I re-educated myself on how the doweling jig is meant to work by testing it on some offcuts. And it made a huge difference in the accuracy of the boxes.
That there is the right way of using the doweling jig.
I went back to one of my older and more abused saw blades to cut the rabbets into the boxes after the mix-up in my last video. And thankfully the ratty old blade cut well enough for these slots that weren't really going to be seen anyway. As I was spending money on the expensive sheet materials, I decided to spend the money on some expensive drawer slides for the project. I've been a believer in the difference it makes buying Blum cabinet hinges for a long time. They're so much more accurate and adjustable than the no-brand ones I have in my kitchen, for example. So I decided to give their drawer runners a go as well. I've been using cheaper runners for other projects successfully, like around the workshop. And the model ones tend to work just fine, but they do come with a lot of little paper cuts of annoyance. I started with one set of bloom slides, and there were a lot to figure out, so I only made one drawer box to start and did a test fit before buying the others. And it looked like it was going to fit together really nicely. I was building these drawer boxes out of 12mm Guernica poplar plywood, which was a lot more manoeuvrable than the MDF. So for some reason I thought it was going to be a good idea to rip these sheets down to size for the drawer boxes on the table saw. Even watching back the video, I'm not sure how I managed to get that first lengthwise cut done going all the way down the first sheet using my table saw. Because when I went to make the same cut on the second sheet, I couldn't figure out how I did it before. And I ended up giving up and using my circular saw on guide rail instead, which was also fine and it actually went a bit better than cutting the MDF did. I then hit copy and paste a couple of times to get more drawer boxes. Then spent a whole lot of confused time figuring out where I needed to install the slides to fit the boxes where I wanted them. I managed to get the slides straight with a combination of a spirit level and clamp and the laser level, and altogether it worked pretty well.
It's almost starting to look like I know what I'm doing.
Once I was satisfied that the drawers were all in the right place, I decided I was safe to fill in all my screw holes on the outer surface of the cabinet. A bit of sanding made them a complete non-issue after all. I hope they stay invisible over time. I gave it a coat of primer, then I finished it with the same vinyl mat I used in the rest of the room, which made it consistent with the walls. Then I embarked on painting the parts of the drawer boxes, again finding the patience to do so before final assembly. I masked off the edges that were going to be glued, as that seemed like a pretty good idea. And after a couple of coats of the same green paint as the inside of the cabinet, it was all looking nice and solid and hard wearing, and I was ready to assemble. Or at least I thought I was. I did a dry fit after the paint was dry and was really glad I did, as one of the rebated edges needed a little more trimming before it went together. I painted the outsides of the boxes after they were assembled. And while they were drying, I turned my attention back to the shelves on the other side of the cabinet. All my cabinet and drawer fronts didn't take up an entire sheet, so I got the offcuts of the melamine ply CNC cut into shelves to fit the gap behind the carcass at the same time as everything else was cut. This ended up being another regretful decision. The lean of the column I was trying to abstract away with this project meant that the cabinet sat further from the wall than I expected when I was planning this project. And that meant that the shelves I'd pre-cut ended up being too small for the space after all. I decided the best approach would be to add a new board against the wall to match the fit of the shelves. And the upside of that was it would give me a better surface to attach the shelves to, rather than the plastered wall would have. Because I wasn't expecting this when I planned the project, I didn't have any sheet material that was big enough to box this in as I intended. So I ended up making a compromise that may or may not annoy me in the future. As the shelves were the melamine coated ply, I got some melamine coated chipboard furniture boards from the DIY store. The flat surfaces matched my nice plywood, and the boards were cheap and easy to fit in the car, but they were also a stark reminder as to why I hate edge banding as much as I do. I can't believe how badly they're banded and how it's meant to be acceptable. I'm still touching this seam in with paint to try and make it less obvious, even though it's been installed for a few weeks now. The upside is that the mel chipboard was pretty much the right size for the job straight from the store though, so I made another little plinth to build this cabinetry on top of. One of the boards needed an ever so slight trimming down to fit in the gap. which I had to do the same way as the ply, with a shallow surface cut on both sides before going all the way through. The boards finally slotted into place, and I began wondering if I was doing completely the wrong thing with this compromise. I anchored the boards to the wall using shims between the board and the anchor to get it plumb and at the correct position for the pre-cut shelves to fit into. I tried to recreate the shim I made against the wall on the other side, and this time my job wasn't nearly as elegant, but a touch of my good friend the decorator's cork did gradually help me tidy it up into something unnoticeable. I then had to do more long-winded mela-mean cuts to get the shelves to fit into the new gap. Even with boarding it out, the gap was not perfectly square, and the shelves were now too big to fit into the gap rather than too small. But cutting them was an extra faff on account of the gap not being perfectly square, so the 3-step cut seemed extra tedious. Having marked out the heights for the shelves at an even spacing, I added holes for dowels which held the shelves up on the wall side. I then got the shelves level, and then I used the laser level to identify where I needed to screw the shelves in from inside of the cabinet to hold them on the other side, and that worked really well. Once all the shelves were in, I painted the cork seam on the left with some more wall paint and filled in the seam at the top as well. And the last detail on these shelves was to just put a little beeswax on the exposed ply edges of the shelves. With that done, the sides of my drawer boxes were dry, so I can embark upon finally installing them and fixing the fronts. I don't think there's an obvious way of getting the fronts aligned perfectly when doing overlay drawer fronts. I ended up making a little template to put the screw holes into the drawer's sub-front in consistent positions. Then I measured where the holes were and put pilot holes in the main front, and I was surprised it got me well within the theoretical adjustment tolerances of the drawer slides. It all went together alright, but I still have a few more adjustments to make on them. I think I've done pretty well with them in the scheme of things though. I think one of the last things I had to do was to install the rail for the coat hangers. I got a simple piece of dowel and some basic mounts, and I made a template for screwing the mounts in straight and level. I then went to tighten the grub screws into the dowel, and I realised that I didn't have the headroom to get a screwdriver in there. At least until I remembered the screwdriver bit ratchet my brother gave me. It was more or less done. Now I finally had the drawer fronts on, I was really glad I changed the plug socket for the one that I found. The clearance on it is pretty tight, but it's not so tight that the drawer is ever going to foul it. Pretty much perfect. I got some of our excess books up on the shelves, finally unpacking some of the last boxes from our old apartment into this cabinet. This shot of colour from the books got me feeling a lot better about the shelves. I even added some double shelves into a couple of the gaps using some scrap birch ply, so I could have some extra shelves in there for some of the smaller books that needed to go in. And of course, the whole purpose of this cabinet was to finally move our coats and other bits and bobs out of the bedroom. Doing so meant I could finally undo some of the disruption that embarking on this Midroom project caused when I cleared everything out.
As for spending the extra money on the project, I think I'm pretty happy with my choices. The Medite Premier Standard MDF ended up being a lot more consistent than the dusty high street stuff that you get for late. And because I got the extra wide sheets, it ended up being very similar in cost as buying 4 sheets off the high street would have anyway. The Poplar Garnica ply was a pretty good choice too. The boards feel really stiff relative to their weight, and I really like how few voids there were in the core, even if the side profile isn't as pretty as birch. Not that it mattered in this case, as I was painting it anyway. The Bloom drawer slides were probably the biggest indulgence in this project. All in, I spent about 200 quid on the 3 sets of push to open and soft close slides. I really like how the runner mechanisms can be synchronised. It's much better than my cheap push to open slides, and I love how the mechanisms are virtually invisible when they're installed. They're a real class act, but the cost would soon add up in a bigger project.
The project certainly had its low points, and there are still a couple more things to fix or dial in, but I'm happy to call the job done as it is now. The storage space is way more practical than it was before I started, and I'd like to believe it looks a whole lot neater as well. Thanks for watching this video.